Okay, am I okay to go live?
Yeah, go for it. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just letting people in, so we will start in just a second. Just bear with us. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event, Building the Future Lessons from the New Towns. I'm Fiona Howie, I'm the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm delighted to be chairing our webinar today. So, as I'm sure people are aware, and hopefully as the healthy number of attendees at our webinar today show, there's definitely a lot of interest in how we might address the housing crisis. And of course, it remains high on the political agenda this year. People will, again, be very conscious that we're waiting for the publication of party manifestos this week. But actually, even without those, we know there's cross-party consensus on the need for more homes. And I think, although it's not always talked of as much, certainly there is some emphasis on the fact that those homes need to be of a high quality. People might well have had a look at the Liberal Democrats manifesto, which was published today. I have to confess, I haven't managed to read all of it, but I did have a quick look at the housing section earlier today. And the Lib Dems manifesto on page 71, if you want to have a look, talks about tackling housing failures by increasing the building of new homes to 380,000 a year, including 150,000 social homes a year, through new garden cities and community-led development of cities and towns. And then slightly later on, they specify that they would be looking to support the building of 10 new garden cities. We know the leader of the Labour Party announced last year through his speech at party conference that if successful at the next election, a Labour government would deliver a new generation of new towns. They've also talked about building 1.5 million new homes over 5 years. We'll be interested to see what the Conservatives put in their manifesto, but the Conservative government, of course, was supporting a garden communities programme, which was giving funding and support to 47 locally led communities with the aim of delivering over 320,000 homes by 2050. And no doubt we will see lots of debate about housing numbers and how many we need. And we know it's easy for politicians to say they'll build more homes, but the challenge really is how do we get those homes and new communities delivered? And as you'll have gathered from the focus of our event today, the TCPA is clear that there's the lessons from the Garden City experiment and the post-war New Towns programme are as relevant today as they ever were. And there's certainly a lot to learn. Before I go any further, I just wanted to confirm we will circulate the slides after the event. And I must also thank the Lady Margaret Patterson Osborne Trust and Pinsent Masons for supporting our event today. Next slide, please, Charlotte. No, hopefully the slides will move on. There we go. There we go. So I know many of the audience already will be TCPA members, or you might well have been to some of our webinars before. So I won't spend too long introducing us, but I did want to take a moment to highlight that we're a charity and we're committed to securing our vision is for homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. And our priorities very much draw on our heritage As people may well be aware, the TCPA was founded in 1899 by the originators of the Garden City movement, and that desire to enable the practical achievement of well-designed and sustainable places for everyone continues to drive the work we do. And I did also want to highlight that actually today is our 125th birthday, so it's actually 125 years ago today was the first meeting of the then Garden City Association. So what better way to mark our anniversary than a webinar that draws on those really important lessons from our past and highlights their relevance to today and to the future. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So just to remind people of the format for our webinar, we've only got an hour, so we will have to rattle through things. There will be a chance, hopefully, as long as our speakers don't go well over their time, there will be a chance to put questions to our speakers. Please use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. I know lots of people are very used to Zoom now, but please do use the Q&A function, and I'll put those to our panel members after we've had our contributions. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleagues, Katie Locke, who's the TCPA's Director of Communities and the Osborne Fellow, and to Hugh Ellis, our Director of Policy. Over to you, Katie.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here to talk to you about what we think is the most extraordinary and misunderstood programme of urban development that's ever been undertaken in the UK, one that transformed the lives of millions of people, providing genuinely affordable homes in places which encouraged healthy lifestyles. Now, myself and Hugh are going to do a bit of a double act with the presentation just now. I should also add I was born and raised in Milton Keynes, New Towns, so perhaps a bit biased in that respect. And Hugh, you had a reflection too on your New Towns experience before we start.
Yeah, Katie, I need to say to everyone that when I was educated in planning, I was educated to be a deep skeptic about new towns. New towns, I think, are often perceived to be a failure, Katie, and that's what actually I was taught. And all I would say is it's been a revelation over the last sort of 15 years, actually understanding the detail and the scale of the success as well as the challenges they face. So I think we're just asking people to have open minds at the beginning of this session. I wish my mind had been a bit more open 30 years ago, but it's kind of open now.
Great, thanks, Hugh. We're also aware there's a real broad spectrum of expertise and knowledge on garden cities on this call. So for those of you that require more detail, we've got a huge amount of resource available for free on the TCPA website with all of the detail of the things that we're going to talk about. And for those of you that are newer to the subject, I really hope we're not talking too fast to not enable you to follow. But we'll get cracking now. So next slide, please. Now, our work on new towns and garden cities has been part of the last 10-12 years renewed campaign for a new generation of garden cities based on modern garden city principles. Next slide, please. And in the process of doing that, we have looked in detail at lessons from the delivery of the garden cities, of delivery of the post-war new towns, and also the delivery of the attempts by the public and private sector since the post-war New Towns programme at delivering new communities, as well as the experience of the New Communities Group, which is a TCPA network of now 29 local authorities that are delivering large-scale new communities. Next slide, please. Now, it is our 125th anniversary, so just to put into context, the post-war New Towns programme followed directly from the TCPA's, the Garden Cities Association's development of the first two garden cities at Letchworth and Welland. And it was already by 1918 that the association's Frederick Osborne was agitating for a government-enabled programme of new settlements in the form of new towns to deal with housing needs following the First World War. And that work continued in the interwar years and throughout the Second World War. So by the time peacetime had arrived in 1945, then Housing Minister Lewis Silkin appointed a New Towns Committee to look in detail at how a new programme of new towns could be delivered. Next slide, please. And the ink was barely wet on the final report of that New Towns Committee when the New Towns Act was passed in 1946. And that's really set the vision for creating a new future for the country following the ravages of war. And it was part of a post-war settlement that also included the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. Now, the New Towns Act set this really powerful combination of the designation of land for a new town with the creation of a New Town Development Corporation, which had all of the powers and remit to do everything necessary to deliver the town. And the new towns were funded by a combination of long-term, low-cost loans from government, from the diversion of resources for things like transport and health from existing public funds, and also from some local authority funding to go towards paying for things like schools. And the New Towns programme, which lasted from 1946 to 1970, led to the delivery of 32 new towns across the UK, which were able to deliver new homes, jobs and communities at speed. Next slide, please. But really importantly, this was about a new future for the nation, and it wasn't just about building homes. It was about creating genuinely affordable homes combined with jobs in healthy communities, but also about creating balanced communities, ensuring there was real investment in the lives that people would be living, in community development, in things like public art, really learning from the Garden City experience about the types of places the new towns might be. Next slide. Now, there's a lot more detail, obviously, about the lived experience of those 32 living and breathing places. But because time is short, we'll cut to actually the end of the New Towns programme, because that provides also some really important lessons for the future. Now, some of the early new town development corporations by the 1960s had already started to transfer their assets to something called the Commission for New Towns, transferring some of those assets back to government. And throughout the 1970s, the changes, the civil unrest in our urban areas, combined with huge increase in interest rates, meant that by the time we get to 1980s, and Margaret Thatcher's government comes into power, and there's huge civil unrest also in our urban areas again, Margaret Thatcher's government decided to put quite a dramatic and fast end to the post-war New Towns programme. There was the corporations were ordered to wind up no matter where they were in their delivery process. And this is the point at which there was a huge betrayal of that original vision of Lewis Silkin to create a new generation of places for people to live. There was a fire sale of the Development Corporation assets to the public sector, and some of those assets, and by assets I mean everything from land to buildings to other financial assets, were given in balancing agreements to local authorities in a combination of liabilities and benefits. And with the exception of two places, Milton Keynes and Peterborough, where members of the development corporations in those places had the foresight to set up organisations to manage some of these community assets, green infrastructure in these two examples, all of the other new towns economies became essentially like any other town. So the authorities that had to manage them had to manage all of these fantastic green infrastructure and public realm assets without the resources to do so adequately. Next slide, please. And the way the new towns were developed and managed has led to some real common challenges and opportunities in those places. Each new town is a living, breathing place with its own distinct identity, but these are some of the common challenges that can be identified. Those relate to things like the renewal of the town centres, most of which were sold off to the private sector, making renewal really difficult, and in a complex mosaic of land ownership, which also resulted from the way the corporations were wound up. Many of the new towns have found that they have experienced congestion later than other towns of a similar age. Fantastic access for cycling, for example, but also for car-based travel, and some real obvious challenges around that. The built heritage of the new towns, some fantastic innovation in architecture and public realm, which in some places is being used as a real catalyst for renewal in the new towns, is really beneficial. But a lack of recognition of that special experience is also meaning that much of that is being lost in the process of renewal of some of the new towns. In relation to housing, there was a huge amount of emphasis on the provision of social housing, but not only was that built all at once, particularly in the early new towns, sometimes using cheap materials, meaning that local authorities are having to do whole estate regeneration all at once, which is obviously expensive. Policies that have happened since, such as the right to buy, have made some of that management even more challenging. And finally, that issue of long-term stewardship, these fantastic green infrastructure and public realm assets, which are present in all of the new towns. It's only the exception of a couple which have enabled to manage that long-term stewardship opportunity. Next slide, please. So from all of this work, and you can read it in detail on our website, we've drawn some key lessons from the new towns experience, which are really important, we think, for the future. I'm just going to go through those briefly. Next slide, please. The first is about the role of national government in identifying locations. This image you may recognise on the right is a total myth. The locations of new towns and their designations were not imposed by central government. Government offered a clear offer and national policy which de-risked at the local level, people coming forward, having done local authority-led studies, many of which have been promoted for several years, but providing the confidence to be able to say we would like a development corporation to be delivered in this area. In others, it prompted a negotiation with government about precisely where new development would take place. But it's really important that national government has that enabling role. Next slide, please. We've looked in detail at the Newtown Development Corporation experience and some of the other models as well, and we remain convinced that the basic architecture of the Newtown development and Newtown development models specifically, there are a number of different development corporation models, remains the most effective way to deliver large-scale new communities. The New Towns Act 1981 is still on the statute books, could be used tomorrow if necessary, but having looked at it in detail, there are some minor alterations that we think need to be made to make it fit for purpose today in relation to climate resilience, in relation to things like healthy placemaking, but really importantly in relation to long-term stewardship and community participation as well. Next slide, please. Thirdly is about the money. And our work looking at the New Towns has proved that a New Towns programme can pay for itself. The key was that government saw it as a national investment priority. And despite challenges, including a huge hike in interest rates said in the 1970s, those 60-year fixed rate loans from central government was repaid with interest by 1996. And government still owns some residual assets in the New Towns via Homes England, which actually still provide an income for Treasury through various covenants. We know that new towns can be highly profitable for government, but it relies on the right financial land management tools to make that a possibility. Next slide, please. We've already talked a lot about stewardship. We've been doing a huge amount of programme of work separately on stewardship in new communities. Please do check that out. In fact, we've got a new resource we've been working on with Prince St Masons that's been published just this morning. But we are clear that stewardship of those fantastic assets created through the new towns is vital for sustainable outcome in new places. Next slide, please. Fifthly, about people. We know that people need to be empowered to be at the heart of decision making. In the early new towns, when Lewis Silkin went to Stevenage, famously people changed the sign on the railway station called Silkingrad. There's huge local opposition. We've also learnt more recently, haven't we, about challenges around local opposition if things are dealt with in the wrong way, as happened with the new towns. But that emphasis that the Newtown Development Corporations put on public participation post-designation and community development is a really important thing to remember when we're thinking about the future, and it's something we'll come back to shortly. And finally, next slide, please. Garden cities and new towns are all about innovation in design, in materials, in tenure, and thinking about how we're going to live. But it was really interesting looking at the experience of the 32 new towns and those that lived in them, that although at the time working for a Newtown Development Corporation was one of the most exciting jobs in urbanism, attracting young architects and urbanists from across the world, there are some examples in residential areas in some of the new towns where it appears the ego of the architect overtook the lived experience and needs of people that were living in these homes. For example, some of the housing in Peterlee and Cumbernauld looked amazing, and the RIBA black and white photos of the design, but actually weren't suited to the climate of Scotland or Durham, and flat roofs leaked and were really hard, the homes were really hard to insulate. So it's really important, if we're thinking about a new generation of places, we innovate, but we don't experiment directly on people that are living in those homes. Next slide, please. So we've taken all of that experience together to think about the future. I'm going to pass on to Hugh for the next few minutes.
Thanks, Katie. So trying to reveal, I think, and unlock the opportunity that new towns provide to meeting the housing crisis. And also at the same time, I think, building on what you were just talking about, design provide an opportunity for this country to restore itself at the cutting edge of how we might live, what really good, healthy design looks like. A lot of those ideas were wrapped up in the white paper we published just earlier this year, which was really trying to set out how we could locate a new towns programme in a wider policy of how we might meet the housing crisis. And just to bear in mind, it's been a sort of quarter of a century since this country had any form of urban policy. And so actually there is a big question mark about, how we're going to live. So one of these, just to highlight, time is short, just 2 or 3 key issues that came from that. The big one, of course, it's very difficult at the moment, is that although there's some very positive stuff being published, I think, about strategic growth, there is still an entrenched mythology that planning is a problem. The reality is that if you want to build homes, high quality homes at a price people can afford in sustainable locations, planning is a solution to this problem. And if only we could persuade public policy makers at the highest level to understand that if you really want to address these problems, to really take responsibility for them, you have to start the conversation by thinking of planning as a solution, rather than constantly thinking of it as a barrier, which gets us nowhere. Next slide, please. So we set out a number of things that needed to happen in relation to making a new towns programme work in the white paper. But it's important to say just quickly that we're not suggesting that new towns are the only thing that needs to happen to solve the housing crisis. They are part of a wider picture, which has sort of 3 components. And just very quickly here, you can see what might be described as the really big stuff, the 35 to 100,000 homes, encompassing the kind of scale of, the Mark 1 to Mark 3 new towns ending in Milton Keynes. And the preconditions I'll come back to for what makes them happen. They are very significant, extremely long-term projects which require a national commitment for 40 to 50 years at least in order to make them happen. But they provide the greatest opportunity for economies of scale and are therefore by far, if you like, the most cost-effective way of achieving growth. Underneath that is local strategic growth, 1,500 to 10,000, which is where the TCPA's new communities group members are largely building under the current framework. They need more. They need all sorts of things to happen for that to really take off, to be honest. Coherent policy from government would be one thing, coherent funding regime would be another. And then finally, there's a continued contribution from the local plan process. But do want to stress here very importantly that we had the New Towns Act was passed a year before the Town and Country Planning Act in this country for a really, really good reason. Town and Country Planning Act is not designed to deal with serious demographic change. It's designed to deal with the normal day-to-day stuff. If you want to seriously deal with demographic change in this country and meet growth strategically, the New Towns Act is written for that purpose. So discuss why haven't we used it for nigh on 50 years and what's the relationship between that with the housing crisis. So it's very important that these tools are different, deliver different functions. Next slide, please. So the National Strategic Plan for Homes, clear and share vision, long-term political commitment, these are all self-evident ideas that you'll all be familiar with. One element of this, though, I think is very important, and that's about building public consent. And that really is going to be important. This balance between the mechanisms and the vision and the conversation, which isn't happening in this country at all and needs to. We have to have a strong vision for how we're going to live. It can't just be about the mechanics, and people have to be involved in that conversation. And I think a national strategy would have to address other issues I'll come back to, but particularly skills and supply chain. There is a lot of talk about, what we could do on day one. Well, you can't build anywhere on day one if you don't have any plasterers, bricklayers, and where you're about to close your last modern methods of construction factory, which is a nation we're about to do. So there's a whole series of really important foundational issues to get right. Ambition for net zero housing is absolutely non-negotiable. This is the place where, at scale, where you can deliver these kind of technologies, build supply chains, and therefore transform, in a more general sense, the sorts of homes we build. Next slide, please. So this is a quick list of making it happen, but given that I'm out of time, I think I'm not going to talk about them in any detail. I've talked about a national plan, talked about the supply chain and training issues. I think deciding scale, number, and locations of new settlements, can it please be evidence-led? And the drivers for the need for housing are complex, not just about demographics, it's also about quality and health and equality. And it's increasingly going to be about moving places for climate change. So it's not a simple argument. There are complex arguments about why we need new places. And we've talked a little bit about modernising delivery bodies, which we must do, and particularly supporting local government. I think development corporations, I think Milton Keynes, and there are people on this call who were there, had a development corporation staff of certainly more than 100, 150 maybe. And, you know, those sorts of skill sets need to be put back into the system. We have to focus on there. Financing of new settlements, that it's not just going to be public money. I think it is going to be long-term private money if we can de-risk that proposition properly for them, which I'm convinced we can. And do bear in mind, I think there have been incremental changes to compulsory purchase, which the last one in the Levelling Up Regeneration Act has dealt with aspects of hope value quite radically in a way, actually. So a lot of that work has been done, which clears the way for delivering these ideas. And then defining the operations of development corporation and embedding the legacy of stewardship, which is already beginning to happen in law. Next slide, please. Just to draw this to a close, I think the question in front of all of us is not, can we do this technically? Of course we can. It will take time, but it's an incredibly exciting proposition. We can do it. The question is there political will to do it? And that will is generated partly from Westminster, but partly also from this idea of a political conversation with all of us about how we are going to live. And the question to leave you all with, and particularly to communities, is it's not that we're not going to build, right? We are going to build. The question is, are we going to build well or not? And the question between new towns and their place in meeting that challenge is whether you want a lot of very poor quality, badly located, poorly built estates bolted on often in ways which are not well connected in public transport terms, or whether you want to seize the opportunity to do something really well. And that's the question that lies on the table. The answer for that question for the TCPA, Fiona, I guess, is pretty obvious, but I'm aware I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I am really, and to Katie, sorry, I'm conscious that you've both covered a huge amount of ground, and we have, as you can imagine, we've got lots of questions coming in about that. So we will pick up some of that, I'm sure, in the Q&A. But first of all, we will have a response from Jamie Lockerbie, who is a partner at Pinson Masons. Jamie's in the planning team and advises a mixture of public and private sector clients on the full remit of planning law matters. So thank you ever so much, Jamie, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Thanks to Katie and to Hugh as well for their contributions. Yeah, I've just got 10 minutes to talk in response to what Hugh and Katie have said. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, you know, people like threes, and I thought there were three. You could sum up really what Katie and Hugh have said and what the TCPA have said in their various papers on this topic, I think, with 3 M's, and I would call that number 1, motivation, which I think comes nicely off the back of what Hugh was just saying. Number 2 is money, and number 3 is management. So just to quickly take those in turn, number 1, motivation. It really, I do think is very much what Hugh was saying, is we have to grasp the nettle on this. And I think when you look back and you read the TCPA's papers on this, I don't think it's any coincidence that the success of the New Towns scheme came off the back of the post-war settlement and a shift in mindset in the country as to what needed to happen to give something back to the populace who'd suffered so greatly in the Second World War. And I find it astonishing that if you think back that the country in 1945, 6, 7 had just come out of 6 years of total war. So an economy built entirely to service and win the war, and all the debt that was incurred in doing that, and yet we still managed to successfully deliver over the next couple of decades and beyond a tremendously on balance successful new homes programme. And I find it difficult to believe in this day and age, despite the challenges we've had from things like the global financial crisis and COVID and the rest of it, that we still can't honestly say that we're in a worse position now than they were in 1945, and yet look what they managed to achieve. So I think that on that note, I did think that when we started seeing the manifestos for the upcoming election, that housing would be a top 3 issue, certainly for Labour, if not for the other parties as well. And I'm quite surprised, I think, that I know the manifesto is not out, but you're actually not really seeing housing being talked of as a top 3 issue. It tends to be NHS, the economy, and it seems to be things like defence that are coming in as the third big issue, or national security is the third big issue. So housing seems to be being pushed out, which I do find surprising, given it being universally recognised that we are in a housing crisis. We as a firm have put out various ideas on how we can get the motivation, and I think it does need to be a change in the way things are done. So I think it was Hugh that was saying TCPA is built for the day-to-day of planning, and I think that's absolutely right. So you need to use a regime shift to end up being in a world where you can deliver these kind of settlements at the scale and pace that you want to. Using the New Towns Act is a way, and can be a way. It's quite old legislation, as TCPA has acknowledged. It's been bolted onto and amended over time, so it's actually quite difficult to navigate. So in a perfect world, my suggestion would be to get that motivation, we should bring in new legislation to deal, modern, up-to-date, fit-for-purpose legislation to deliver this new homes programme. One thing I would add is to my mind, it would make a lot of sense to make housing, bring housing of a scale to be decided within the nationally significant infrastructure regime. I appreciate that comes with tensions in terms of local engagement and participation and buy-in to the process, because the NSIP regime is a centralised regime. So I do appreciate there's an issue there with perceptions of imposition of these new settlements. But I do feel like the NSIP regime provides the kind of toolkit that does allow for successful delivery of these types of community, because it provides a regimented timescale process. It allows additional powers for the consenting authority, so things like compulsory purchase all gets wrapped up in one consenting statutory instrument effectively, and I think that would be a good option. My number 2 on the M's, the two of the 3 M's is money. Again, as you said, private sector's got a big role to play in this, but I think it does need to be able to made to work for them, otherwise they just won't do it. I understand viability is a touchy subject, but ultimately it is true that if the numbers don't stack up, the private sector just won't deliver things. And in the project we've been involved as a firm, where you've seen success in areas, things like the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, Ebbsfleet, places like that, you've had significant upfront state intervention. So in the Olympics, you had the delivery of the games being the catalyst for that legacy community development. In Ebbsfleet, you had the HS1 line that provided that fast link into London. And then a project can be built around that. So you do need the state to intervene upfront and carry the cost, I think, for the upfront infrastructure. That doesn't then mean that they can't recoup it, because there are legal mechanisms. There are things that state can do at a central and local level to recover that significant upfront investment. So things like strategic infrastructure levy. So look at what we did, or what the mayor did in Crossrail, using MSIL to fund Crossrail. Retrospective pooled Section 106 contributions, so putting in place a policy to recover from developers who come after and benefit from the upfront infrastructure a share of the recuperated cost of building that. And the state taking land holdings, strategic land holdings, that then will increase in value as the placemaking takes place and the area regenerates. The value of that land will increase, and if that's held by the government, then obviously that has an asset value to it. Lastly, then, my number 3 in my M's was management. In the TCPA documents, it acknowledges that some of the, where there have been failures, some of those biggest failures have come from a lack of proper stewardship of these communities. And that's something that, you know, I think everybody recognises now, and certainly we at Pinson Masons have got a big drive in advising both public and private sectors on stewardship strategies for successful delivery of new communities. You know, a lot we're finding on the schemes, we're advising on where it's advising the developer. The local planning authorities are asking for a stewardship strategy to be put in with the planning application, that then can set out stewardship for the scheme, or at the very least a framework. If it's a very large multi-phase scheme, you've got a stewardship framework about how things will be done, and then that can be delivered on a phased basis. And ultimately we're looking for setting out what are the stewardship aims, what are the aims, how will this community be measured as a success, how will those principles be actually enacted on a site-wide and a phased basis, and crucially, where's the funding going to come from to deliver and maintain the items that the community items that will make a successful place in terms of stewardship. And I think that takes me to my 10 minutes. So I hope that was helpful, and yeah, to the extent there's any questions from me, very happy to deal with them.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Please can I invite Katie and Hugh back? Thank you so much. While I now try and grapple with my screens, which are now all over the place. So yes, we've had lots of questions. Katie, I could see you were typing to try and reply. So I will try and I'm going to have to group some together, and there are some themes that are coming out of them. So I'll do my best. But first of all, I think this one's for the TCPA more than Jamie, and someone has rightly pointed out that the Green Party have also said that they want 150,000 new affordable social homes, and you're right, I didn't give an overview of all of the manifestos and commitments, so apologies for that, but we will await them all with interest throughout this week. But they've noted that the Green Party has also talked about wanting extra greenbelt protections, and so if they were to form a coalition with Labour, would that threaten the delivery of new towns / urban extensions in areas where they are needed? So perhaps Hugh, if you could pick up that one to start with, please.
Yeah, because it's always my joy to talk about Greenbelt in these issues. For me, it's very important to understand that new towns and Greenbelt policy were once hand in hand and two sides of the same coin. They were part of, if you like, a social contract, that rather than seeing the ever expansion of existing urban areas, which basically deprive people of access to nature, what you would have is a heavy process of designating Greenbelt and an equally heavy process of designating new communities beyond that Greenbelt. So the two things should be seen as complementary policies. And I think culturally we need to see that again, that if we preserve Greenbelt, which I'm sure we should, then we also need to complement that with answering the question, where are we going to build? So I don't think there's an essential contradiction, or at least there wasn't. And indeed, I think, Katie, in the story of the designation of Milton Keynes, you can see how that contract fulfilled itself very practically in a local authority leading a designation process for Milton Keynes and essentially doing a deal about preserving enhanced protections for some parts of their area. And the deal was, and a new city in another part of the area. That seems to be, when it's locally led, a very sensible idea. So that there is no intrinsic conflict. It all depends on where. And I hope we don't get bogged down after July the 5th in too many arguments about Greenbelt. There's huge opportunities outside of Greenbelt to meet the housing crisis.
Okay, thank you. And then Katie, if I put this one to you, I'm trying to group them together and multitask, I'm doing really badly. So someone has suggested, and I think rightly, it has been slightly challenging about whether it's very easy again for political parties to commit to new towns. And of course, there are lots of lessons to learn, but actually delivering them will be challenging for multiple reasons. Somebody has asked, is there really that recognition from political parties of the need for long-term commitment to that? But also someone has asked if Labour and the Lib Dems are promoting an impossible ideal. So of course, because they haven't gone into detail, certainly to date, so they're not promising the necessary government loans or infrastructure budgets and funding that, as you've highlighted, were a key part of the programme in the past. So should we, either the TCPA or the planning profession, be actually saying, calling them out on this being impossible? Or is there a way that we can make sure that it is possible for a new programme of new towns?
Oh, thank you. I think it's a really useful question, and it's something that's at the forefront of our minds as well. I think all of the work that we have been doing has proved that you do need to take that long-term approach. There needs to be significant upfront investment for that long-term gain, and it requires all of those preconditions that Hugh set out in his section regarding the white paper as well. And we are trying our best to persuade all political parties of the importance of those lessons and really embedding that ambition. We have been promoting new towns and garden cities for 125 years now, and we recognise them as an essential part of the solution going forward, but not at any cost. And that's why we will continue to reiterate there needs to be this investment and ambition to do things a different way. We're not starting from scratch with new towns. We've been through the post-war new towns experience. There's also our experience with the eco towns, with the various attempts by the private sector since, show that if you're going to be ambitious, you need to think differently about the way these things are approached. So we will continue to make that case, and we really hope these resources will help others to join us in making that case, because there is a huge risk that any new government could take forward a programme of new settlements without having that ambition and conditions around standards and investment, which would really undermine the ambition of what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Katie. I think back to you, Hugh, although Jamie, if you want to come and do wave as well, but Katie equally do come in as well. We have, again, I think understandably had a question about whether specifically Labour in the party, but actually any political party that is arguing for new large scale settlements, do they really understand the need for development corporations to buy all the development land in the designated area close to existing use value, without which the delivery process won't work? And the person asking the question has expressed concern that there's a lack of political courage to push that through. So Hugh, thoughts on that? And then there have been a couple of other questions on hope value, which perhaps I'll pick up if you don't cover that anyway.
Well, I think the heart of it is hope value, because I think that, you know, the Milton Keynes and the Myers case there slowly from the mid-1950s moved us into a form of a compensation code, which was essentially extremely generous for landowners, and created what the courts have seen as this fantasy land of trying to understand hope value. Essentially what that is to be compensated for future value of permissions which haven't yet been secured on your land, but speculatively might exist. I think the difference, so as there's two parts to the question, as to whether or not everyone in Whitehall and Westminster understands the detail. I don't know if people want me to smile a lot at this point, but but I feel like saying, well, probably not is the answer to that question. But as to whether or not significant progress has been made on the hope value question, my reading of, and I think others' reading of what the current government did, in a sense slightly surprisingly, in the Levelling Up Regeneration Act, was to bear down very hard on limit the scope of hope value. Now, of course, Jamie, that all has to be tested in the courts. So ultimately, your profession has the final say about whether this is effective or not. But I do think it's significant progress, along with other quite fragmented and incremental changes to compulsory purchase law that have taken place over the last 5 years. But all I can do is to agree that that is the fundamental heart, and it speaks just quickly to the answer to many other questions about how development corporations were able to pay back their loans. Well, they were able to pay back their loans because they quite rightly were able to acquire land at the right price, which is central to absolutely everything. And then they use the uplift in those values generated through the development process in essentially a mutualized way. And I think the point that Katie made that's so powerful is that if those assets had been left in the hands of the community, sort of Letchworth model, rather than being essentially robbed in 1981, then towns could have reinvested. And that financial model remains sound. The difference now is the private sector could play a role in financing if we get the model, as Jamie has said, right, in terms of de-risking for them. That's their incentive if the public sector is master developer and de-risks, and the payback for the public sector is growth, is development, is investment.
Thank you. We've also inevitably had questions about locations, but also I think related to that, questions about whether this will be possible without regional or strategic planning. So staying with you perhaps for a second, Hugh, I know you talked about the need for a national strategy, but do we need subnational/regional planning as well?
It's easy, isn't it? Yes. I think that there are, and I'm sure that will come back in some form. It's very difficult to manage a place without having a greater than local authority boundary, view of how places operate. That's not how geography works. So, yeah, of course, the location process, I think, should be about national plans broadly understanding where infrastructure and opportunity and constraints play out. And then sub-regional planning playing a role in more detailed identification of where that might take place. If we can get as obsessed as we like with locations, but to be really clear, locations have to follow evidence. So just as a piece of heresy, one of the nuts parts of the development process for the UK is to focus all housing growth in areas at the moment that basically don't have any water. And that's an issue. So that's what sub-regional planning is meant to do. It's meant to square those circles or push development into different places. And I think, Katie, that innovation you saw with some of the northern new towns, we shouldn't forget that. This isn't just a Southeast agenda, and it never was a Southeast agenda. It was about a programme of national renewal, as Jamie was saying, post-war. And that's something that I'm watching very carefully to see if any new government is wise enough to be able to use these mechanisms actually to renew economies in the north.
Thank you. And Katie, just coming back to you, I know you talked about the existing legislation that needs some tweaks but could be fit for purpose. Wondered if you might say a bit more about that. There have inevitably been questions about community participation, and I know both you and Hugh talked about that in your presentations, but how do we really make sure that that runs through any future development corporations?
Well, there's different aspects to that process-wise. Some of that is the role of people in the process of designation and things like the right to be heard at different points in the process. Some of that is about the powers and remit of the development corporations themselves and the principles they have to abide by on delivery and the role of public participation in those processes. But more broadly, we've also been advocating at a more strategic level for a national conversation about how we're going to deal with the housing crisis and our housing needs. We need, as Hugh said, this whole portfolio of solutions, and then we've developed such a lack of trust in the planning and housing and delivery process that has developed over the last few decades, that any new programme, positive new programme of new development is going to be received with scepticism. So we're really clear that any new government needs to also, along with any other programme of new settlements, needs to launch a national conversation with people about the fact that we're going to need to think differently about how we provide homes, and let's have an honest conversation about where those can be located and the types of homes and places that we need. And we think if that's accompanied by a national spatial plan, those things that Hugh mentioned, the spatial planning Hugh mentioned, but a transparent and honest process about the decisions that are taken about where we locate homes and growth and why that's happening, we think it will really transform that conversation and how people feel about new development.
And Katie, just staying with you for a second, because I know you might have typed the answer to this one, but I think it's worth talking about briefly on here anyway. Obviously, we've been focused today on the lessons from the New Towns programme, but we do, of course, work with local authorities and others at the moment involved in large-scale development, including through our new communities group, and we are very conscious there are lessons to learn through those processes as well. So I wondered if you could just touch on that, sort of what are some of the more recent lessons that we think that any future government need to be picking up as well? Well,
frankly, the heroic local authorities that have been trying to deliver at scale despite the complex and confused policy environment is really to be applauded. In particular, those officers who are working on these projects, tiny little teams. We're talking about 150 people working for Milton Keynes Development Corporation. We have members of our new communities group that are delivering tens of thousands of homes with just 5 people in charge of it. And so that skills lesson capacity is a really, really important one from that. But I think the other thing to mention in relation to that is that a lot of those sites have come forward within our planning system and approach, which hasn't taken a strategic approach to thinking about locations, which hasn't had that high level commitment to standards. And so it's been really relying on the resource capacity and campaigning of local leaders So that strong local leadership is really important, and also the work of officers making it happen at the local level. But frankly, some of those larger schemes have been trying to come forward within a system that isn't set up to deal with the long-term nature of large-scale development. New communities are a unique and complex type of development that are different to other types of development. And the way that some of the projects are assessed through by PIMS, for example, they're not set up to deal with the different sequencing of information in relation to new communities, or some of the different opportunities and challenges in relation to different development cooperation models, let alone that strategic approach to identifying locations. So there's real lessons from those experiences to learn in terms of that strong local leadership, in terms of that consistent commitment from government about a commitment to new communities, because there has been such policy and political change in relation to the commitment to new communities over the last 10 years. It's been really difficult for the public sector at the local level and also the private sector to invest, because there's real uncertainty about it. So providing that certainty. And we had a question as well about some of those existing sites that are coming forward, and also the role of urban extensions as well as whole new settlements. And we've been really clear in our work and our advocacy that we do need that whole range of solutions. And in some places, urban extensions will be the right solution, and in some places it's larger settlements. But there is a huge amount of work that's already gone on by many local authorities to deliver high quality places, and we hope that government will continue to support the best practice examples of those, as well as thinking about new places.
Thank you, Katie. That's really helpful. In fact, excellently picked up lots of points from many questions there. That's incredibly helpful for me as well. Hugh, I'm going to come to you, and Jamie, I'm going to bring you in as well in just a second. Hugh, in your contribution, you talked about the entrenched mythology that planning is a problem, and of course the TCPA, and I know others on this webinar are very clear that planning is very much part of the solution and can be transformational if it's given the right policy hooks and legislative framework and resourcing. So somebody has asked, what are we going to do? How do we change the narrative around that? So Hugh, if you go first, and then Jamie, I might bring you in for a perspective, please, from the private sector as well.
I think, well, first of all, it is, when I say entrenched, I think it is everywhere. And it's really difficult because it's become a very easy and very lazy default response, I think, particularly inside Westminster and Whitehall, because planning is a very interesting thing to blame for why lots of other players in this process are not necessarily doing their job. So let me be a little bit challenging about that. I mean, first of all, you know, what the white paper focused a lot on on delivery rather than consent. The government's default response to not building enough homes is to deregulate the planning process. And we've been involved in versions of that for 15 years, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the complexity of the development process, which requires actually the interaction and sequencing of a whole series of quite complex factors in a democratic context. That doesn't happen by chance, and it's not something the private sector is going to do without taking enormous risks. So there has to be a new partnership, which you have to be able to forge, a more grown-up partnership, I think, between private and public sector about that. As to whether it will change, though, if you want my honest answer, it will only change through crisis. Jamie mentioned the Second War kicking this off. But let's be clear about it, within 5 years, the impact of climate change on land values, which is already having a transformational impact on the way we live, is going to raise big questions. And the answer to those questions is get organised. And it's a simple choice for us all. It's not about planners and planning. It's a simple choice between being organised for the future, which sensible societies are, or having a chaotic, hey, let's make it up as we go along, which might be a lovely British tradition, but has always ended pretty badly, I think. So the case for planning will be made not by me or TCPA, but by the external challenges that we have to grapple inside the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. Jamie, if I can bring you in.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, in my experience, and I think Pinson Mason's experience, is when people are anti-development, large-scale housing development, a lot of the time, in fact, in my experience, most of the time, it's down to the same things you hear, which is, but the school's already full, but I can't get a GP appointment, but the road is already clogged. and therefore all they see is those houses just exacerbating problems that already exist for them. And I think if you so there's a wider piece there about if you can improve the infrastructure environment for people, then I think they will be much more accommodating to change in their area. And then you've got the other things about them being involved in the process. So, you know, all the stakeholder engagement stuff, making sure you do that genuinely and not as a box ticking exercise. And then I think in terms of how do you do that? Well, actually, most developers do some form of, and most of them are pretty good, some, you know, stakeholder engagement stuff, but you can actually write it into law like we do for wind farms at the moment. So there's actually legislative provision that for wind farms, onshore wind, they have to consult. There is a legal requirement to consult with the local community before they go ahead with the development. You know, whilst most developers do some form of consultation, there at the moment there's no legal requirement to do it. It's just a best practice thing, and if you don't want to face, you know, unexpected issues later on, it's best to talk to people. So that's why they do it, but there's no legal requirement. And then I think secondly, it's about making sure that the infrastructure provision is set out very clearly for people to understand what are they going to get, and making sure those things are followed through, so that there aren't cascades out for developers to not provide things, you know, in certain circumstances, or if there are, it's made very clear to everybody the circumstances within which things will and won't be delivered. Because, you know, I think that's again where people get upset, is where they're led to believe that something will happen and then it doesn't. So, you know, I think if you make those changes, I think in some cases, or a lot of cases, you'll find people are more accepting of development in their area. Obviously there'll be some people who just don't want change, and that will always be the case, but I think the vast majority of people, it's other issues rather than the principle of development itself.
Okay, thank you very much. Final question, I'm just going to pose it to you, Katie. I think, is there a tension between levelling up, which seeks to stimulate decentralised investment into existing towns with high levels of deprivation, and a programme of new towns which might effectively outcompete existing towns needing investment?
Thanks, Fiona. I mean, the simple answer to that is no, we need both. It's not one or the other in our perspective, and that's why we need this national strategic approach to really understand where new growth needs to happen, where renewal needs to happen. And that includes, as someone has asked a question about, that includes looking at our existing new towns, which in many places are an unfinished project. They are in strategically beneficial locations. The development corporations were wound up prematurely. And some of those locations, particularly in the north of England, might be really suitable places for regeneration and also provision of new growth and development as well. So no, the answer is we need both, and we need a strategic approach to understand where should be prioritised.
Thank you ever so much, Katie. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to wrap up. I do really want to thank Jamie and Hugh and Katie for their contributions. Oh, do you want to come back in, Katie?
No, sorry.
Accidental hand up. Okay, good. I really want to thank all of the three of you for your time today. As we're really mindful that we covered a huge amount of ground. Hugh and Katie have written a book about this, so this isn't a hard sell, but it is available on our website. So please do, if you want to find out more, get it from a good library, or indeed from our the shop section of our website. But I think some of the key takeaways, and I think from the questions, I think people are right to ask lots of these questions about how we get public support for these, whether the political parties really understand what they're committing to when they are saying they'll build 10 new garden cities or they'll build a new generation of new towns. This is a really huge commitment that we would need a new government to really understand the long-term commitment that would be needed to drive those forward. So I think for me that was a really key takeaway from Katie's, that of course we need a national government and that to really lead on this and drive this forward, but that's not to impose it at the local level, but that is to de-risk it and to give those reassurances that actually we won't start building a new generation of new towns or garden cities that will never quite come to fruition, or will be a sort of poor reflection of actually that original garden city vision that Katie touched on. I think Hugh's point around actually this is very much one of a portfolio of solutions. It's not the only thing that would tackle the housing crisis, but we believe it is part of the range of solutions that are necessary. Is also a really key one. And then the final thing I would highlight is that, of course, thinking about long-term stewardship of any new place is really key, and that needs to happen right from the word go. It can't be an afterthought, because as we've learnt the lessons from the new towns, they do, they need regeneration, they need that long-term commitment, and the long-term stewardship models are really central to that. So I had asked a colleague if they would post the link in the chat, but I don't think they have, but Katie has put the link in one of the answers. So I don't know if we can, but maybe we will follow up with an email with some links to those resources, because again, we have published plenty about this, but we still find that people aren't clear about what some of those really important messages on long-term stewardship. Yes, right, it's in the chat very quickly. There's a link to lots of resources there around long-term stewardship. It really is a crucial part of those lessons learned. Right, it's 2:30, so I'm really conscious that people will need to get on with their days, but thank you again. Thank you to the Lady Margaret Patterson Osborne Trust and to Vincent Masons for supporting us, and many thanks again to all of our audience for your enthusiasm and interest in this really important topic. Thank you.
Thanks.